The African National Congress has called for calm in the United States of America following ongoing protests after the murder of George Floyd, allegedly at the hands of a police officer. Floyd's death reignited the Black Lives Matter movement, founded in 2013 to campaign against systemic racism and violence inflicted on black communities. The ANC's statement comes as news broke of an independent autopsy finding that Floyd died of asphyxiation from sustained pressure. Floyd died in Minneapolis, Minnesota last Monday after being arrested on suspicion of using a counterfeit banknote. A video taken by a bystander shows an officer kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while other officers looked on. SABC News correspondent Nick Harper joins us now. Nick, let's start with that independent autopsy. What do we know about it, and what impact will it have, if any, on the chain of events?
Well, that independent autopsy very much contradicting the other autopsy that came out, suggesting that it was not just one officer who contributed to the death of George Floyd, and not the fact that he had underlying health conditions, but also that it was two other police officers on the scene, there were 4 in total, who were also leaning on George Floyd, compressing his chest, so not just his neck region. And of course, that is an important development in this whole process, as the family are saying that we've only had the charging of one police officer so far, Derek Chauvin, who was kneeling on George Floyd's neck. But they're saying that the other 3 police officers on the scene, especially these 2 who were on his back, should also be charged as well. They haven't so far, and of course it's now been 8 days since George Floyd's death, but the family pushing very hard for those charges to be brought against the other officers who were there on the scene as well.
So I'm assuming that no accountability has been brought to bear on the other 3 as we speak.
That's right, those charges have not yet been brought against those other officers. I just want to tell you a little bit where we are at the moment. We're down at the White House. It's about 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And these people around us have been gathering throughout the day since first thing this morning when the overnight curfew was lifted. If we wander in this direction, I'm going to try and take you all the way down to the 8-foot fence that was erected overnight by the security and the police and the military who are here. Before that, there's been much lower barriers. And of course, in some nights, we've seen protesters managing to breach the park that separates this street from the White House. If I just take you around in this direction, you'll see that there are a large number of people, many of them with signs. They've been chanting throughout the day. They've just been kneeling in solidarity for the last few minutes, continuing to chant, "Kneel with us," chanting "Black Lives Matter," really asking for justice, because the people here also want those charges brought against the other police officers who were there on the scene, not just Derek Chauvin. They want all the officers to be held accountable. It's a little bit busy in this direction. I'll take you this way. But just to say, it's certainly a very busy scene. And this type of protest is one that's being played out across the United States. We've seen protests in 75 major cities. Here in Washington, D.C., it's been no different for the last 8 days since George Floyd's death.
And as you say, Nick, these protests taking place outside of the White House following statements by President Donald Trump threatening to deploy the police on the protesters. Has that been realized? I know people have been criticizing him for what they call fanning the fires.
That's right. He was very defiant in his speech at the White House yesterday evening. You can probably see the White House behind me. Last night, the scenes here was one of a peaceful protest, at which point the police who were defending this area used tear gas and stun grenades to clear the scene just ahead of President Trump speaking inside the White House Rose Garden. In that, he said that he would be willing to use military on the streets of the United States if individual governors in different states didn't use what he felt was enough force. He's been telling governors that they need to dominate the streets. They need to be able to show the protesters essentially who's boss. But that's come in for some heavy criticism, with people right across the United States saying he should be coming out with a message of calm, a message of unity, rather than that combative stance that we saw from the president, suggesting that military and much more force was what was needed rather than a calming of this situation.
And I understand that there's been a conversation around the president's powers at this point and what he is limited to do and not over this threat to deploy the military. Has there been any clarification as yet that if he chooses to do that, that he can do that?
No clarification yet to that extent. It's obviously something that the president has wanted to do since the start of these protests. It's something that he's mentioned on Twitter a number of times about he feels that state governors and officials in cities, that they haven't taken a great enough response. That's something that he's called for on numerous occasions. But of course, with that speech in the White House, it makes it much more official, saying that he will use the full extent of his powers, which are still undefined, as to what he can do to put police, to put military, to put National Guard, not just onto the streets of Washington, D.C., but right across the country.
And our viewers might have seen pictures from yesterday of tear gas being fired at the protesters. That was to allow President Trump to go to St. George's Church, I believe. What is the scenario like now? You mentioned it's somewhat calm, but are there expectations that it could flare up again later? Because when we spoke the last time, it was a case of the later it gets, the more agitation seems to rise.
No peace.
That's right. You mentioned St. John's Church. I'm just going to point to this church behind me. This is the church that President Trump walked across to from the White House yesterday evening. And it was this street that was cleared by police using the tear gas, using the stun grenades. That church has been largely boarded up now. The side windows have been covered over with wooden boards. And that has been heavily criticised, not just from protesters, but also from church officials right across America. Some of them saying that he essentially used tear gas, used stun grenades to create a photo opportunity for himself, clearing peaceful protesters in a way that was using much more force than was required. That has come under heavy criticism from those officials within Washington, D.C., but also the religious community as well.
What are sentiments around the president? I know there's often the polls, popularity polls that are done around him. Is there any indication of how America as a whole is feeling about President Donald Trump at the moment, especially his handling over the George Floyd issue, the protests, etc.?
Well, the election in November to decide who will be in the White House for the next 4 years is 5 months from today. And opinion polls, as they stand, suggest that if the election was called right at this moment, President Trump would not be re-elected. His rival, the Democrat rival Joe Biden, is out in front in this polls. But of course, so much can happen between now and then. The president has had a lot to deal with recently. His handling of the COVID-19 pandemic across the United States has been heavily criticized. And now his handling of the protests are being heavily criticized. So we haven't seen the past week or so his handling of that playing out in the polls yet, but there is a feeling that potentially, considering the criticism that has come out from some quarters, especially from the likes of the people around me here today, we're unlikely to see his poll numbers rise. But like I say, there's still a very long way to go between now and November. A lot can happen to change those polls.
So, Nick, what about sentiment towards law enforcement officers? We mentioned that these protests are taking place all around the United States. In Atlanta, we saw that 6 policemen were arrested for using heavy-handed tactics on 2 college students who they accused of transgressing the lockdown. What is the atmosphere around law enforcement and how the police themselves are being viewed in general during this time?
Well, of course, it depends who you ask, but if you ask these protesters, they would tell you that the reason why they're protesting is police brutality, and yet what they're seeing day after day, night after night, is continuing police brutality. Brutality against protesters, brutality against the media, It's something that they've seen play out over the last week, and they're saying enough is enough. That level of brutality, that level of force shouldn't be used. But then, of course, if you ask people from more conservative sides of America, Donald Trump's base, for example, they would say that there is this need for a heavier hand of the police to crack down harder on the violence that we've seen flaring up as a result of these protests.
Nick.
Many of them, of course, like this one, are completely peaceful protests, but we have seen that violence flare up, and some people are saying the police need to deal with it in any way that they can.
All right, thank you very much, Nick. Nick Harper, SABC News correspondent in Washington, D.C.